So my son was a sophomore in college, and he called me one evening. He said, "I'm in a little bit of trouble." Well, it turns out a single marijuana joint in Carter County, Tennessee is potentially, back then, a felony. So he was kicked out of his Christian college, and then it took a fair amount of time and a good bit of money to make sure there was nothing on his record. And Jonathan came home utterly and completely lost. I'd never seen him so lost. He decided to come out here to finish his college work. And when I came out for his graduation, I said to him after it was all over, I said, "Jonathan, there was a church father, and his church father talked about the dark night of the soul." His name was John of the Cross, and he talked about the dark night of the soul. And I said, "Buddy, you made it through the long, dark night all the way to morning." And he said, "Yeah, I did. Well, this morning we're going to talk about somebody who was in the dark night of the soul. It's the most important story Jesus ever told. The third of 3 stories he told about lostness that show up in the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. This is a story of a father who had 2 sons. Now, the younger of the 2 sons decided it was time for him to separate himself from his family and go out on his own in the world. And note that this is, in fact, typical adolescent behavior. Teens hit their later teen years and they recognize it's time for them to separate themselves from mom and dad, and they do it in 2 distinctly different ways. Boys use the flight method. They're 18, they have their driver's license, they just disappear for the next 4 or 5 years. You don't see them except for food and laundry. That's about it. They're just gone. Girls do not do that. Girls use the fight method. They stay in your house and just verbally spar with you for, the better part of a decade. If you've had a teenage daughter, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and delightful time. Now, during this period, our children find things wrong with us. Now, there are 2 reasons they find things wrong with us. First of all, why would you leave the people who provide your every single need if there was not something seriously wrong with these people? So to be able to separate from home, they have a vested interest in finding things wrong with us. The second reason they find things wrong with us is because there's things wrong with us. And now they're in their later teen years and they can see quite clearly what those things are, and they think we've never been told about them before, and so it's their job to tell us about them. But if you can make it through those years, I can tell you with confidence, by the time your children are 30, you do get your 5-year-old back. It just takes a good long while before you get that person who just adores you back, but it actually does eventually happen. And as difficult as these years are, most of the time, our children do not want to see us dead. I say most of the time because apparently in this story, the young man may not have felt that way. So he went to his father and asked for the 1/3 of the family inheritance that would eventually be his as the younger child. But in their culture, as in ours, you generally did not get your inheritance until your parents passed away. So basically, he was saying to his father, it's all right if you were just dead because I want my 1/3 of the family inheritance. For whatever reason, his father gave it to him. And so he heads off to Florida and goes to a party university and drinks away his freshman year. You know this story, you've heard it before. And finally, after 6 years, he gets a bachelor's degree in general studies. What's he going to do with that? And he doesn't want to get a job, so he just squanders the rest of the family fortune. And a famine hits the land, and he is starving. So he goes back to the only thing he knows, farming. And he gets a job feeding pigs. Now, Jesus was speaking to a population that saw pigs as the dirtiest animal that existed on the face of the earth. So Jesus was saying this young man hit rock bottom. And the way they fed pigs in that day was to go out into the open fields, shake carob trees, which would cause the carob pods to fall to the ground. And then the pigs would eat the carob pods. And here he was shaking carob trees, wishing he could eat the carob pods, when Jesus says he came to his senses. I love that phrase. Did you ever come to your senses, that kind of aha moment? So a couple of years ago, I was going through a really difficult period, and a couple of my close friends were telling me about particular flaws in my personality that were getting me in trouble time and again. And I thought it was interesting because these are flaws that had never shown up before in my previous life. And so I was talking to my former wife, who I'm still quite close to, and we're both therapists, we work together. And I said, yeah, I apparently, since I transitioned from Paul to Paula, I have gotten some bad habits and have developed some personality traits that are really not very good, that were never there before. She said, oh, I hate to be the one to tell you this. They were always there, but you were a powerful white guy, and so you got a free pass. Women don't get a free pass. I have discovered that is true. And women do not give other women a free pass, also true. And I came to my senses. Because I remembered all those times I would say to people, you've got to be open to stringent self-examination, and you must be open to challenge from the outside. And I had no idea that because of my positional power, nobody was going to challenge me from the outside. I did not know, and therefore I did not see. And yes, these particular flaws had always been with me. It's a tough thing to have to come to your senses. The young man comes to his senses. The major sense to which he comes is hunger. And so he heads home and he has this plan. He's going to say to his father, I've squandered the family fortune. I know I don't deserve to be a son any longer, but just allow me to be one of your servants so I can have a roof over my head and food to eat. And so he heads home, and when he's still a long way from the house, he sees his father running toward him. Now, the father is seeing him when he's a long way from the house because the father has been out looking for him the entire time. So now the son sees the father running toward him, and I don't know about you, but if I have squandered my family's fortune on loose living, and I finally come back home and I see my father running toward me, I might turn around and run the other way. The father catches up to him, and the son tells the father everything he's done wrong. And the father's response is not exactly what the son expected. 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, starting with verse 20. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, and then bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Now, in that culture, a ring, a robe, and sandals were signs of sonship, honor, and power. So when he brought those out for his son, he was saying to the son, oh, I fully accept you. I love you every bit as much as I ever did, and I believe in you every bit as much as I ever did. And in doing that, the father gives the son a blessing. Now, I'm older than dirt, and my kids are all in their 40s. But it's interesting. The one thing we get to do as parents right to the end is to bless our adult children, because they never outgrow their need for our blessing. They need to hear that we're proud of them, what we see that's wonderful about them. They never, ever outgrow the need for a blessing. So I'm a pastoral counselor. That's what my doctorate is in. And a number of years ago, I was referred a client who was a recovering alcoholic. And this particular individual had been through rehab 3 times, which is not at all unusual. But in his case, what was unusual was he had gone years between times of relapse. And so finally, his AA sponsor said to him, you got something going on beneath the alcoholism and you need to deal with it. So he came to me and We started working on things and found out in pretty short order that his father had not once ever told him that he was a fantastic musician. Not only was he a fantastic musician, a number of you would likely know his name. He was quite well known, quite successful, but his father could never, ever tell him that. He could not give his son a blessing. His mother, terrified of the father, who was abusive, also never a blessing. The other son could do no wrong. The younger son could never do wrong. Everybody Loves Raymond, you remember that show? Yeah. That was the younger son's experience, and he was devastated by that. Never once receiving a blessing from his father, and so what should have been obvious to him was not. His first time of relapsing, the death of his mother. His second time of relapsing, the death of his younger brother. And his third time relapsing, the death of his father. Because he knew he would never receive that blessing that is so important for all of us to receive. So a couple of weeks ago, I was watching the Steve Martin documentary, if you've seen it on Apple TV+. It's a 2-part documentary, and I was interested in seeing it because when I did the audio version of my book, As a Woman, I had the best engineer with Simon & Schuster. They just did this amazing engineer. He actually had been the chief engineer on Pet Sounds and an engineer on Graceland, 2 of the greatest rock and roll albums in history. But at this point in his life, kind of semi-retired, he's doing recording of audiobooks. And he had just come from Steve Martin's house. This was right at the end of COVID, and had been recording his book. And he said, he's a very good man, but he might be the saddest man I have ever seen. That kind of stuck with me, and so I watched the documentary, and yeah, sure enough, you can see it in the documentary. And guess what? Never received a blessing from his father, even when he was unbelievably successful, filling stadiums around the world. He would invite his father, the father would come into his dressing room after and would tell him everything he had done wrong. Our children need our blessing. They need to know we believe in them. So Jonathan finished college, and then he got his master's degree in education. And then for 5 years, he taught school in West Philadelphia, was fantastic at it. But then the chief of operations of the church planting organization I ran, which was very, very large, went to my son and said, we'd love it if you would consider planting a new church in Brooklyn. Did not tell me about this. I had no idea. Once I heard about it, I was like, I have a really high profile in my denomination. I'm one of the national leaders. He's going to be in my shadow. I don't know. But my son took the job, started the church, and the church became wildly successful. One of the largest churches now that's open and affirming in Brooklyn. I think half of Broadway goes to his church, which means the music is incredible. But the first time I ever had a chance to hear him preach was just a few months later. And he was phenomenal. I mean, amazing. And really, honestly, he's one of my 3 favorite preachers on earth. And now you want to know who the other 2 are? One is Stan Mitchell at Grace Point Church in Nashville. The other is Michael. And not just because he's here. You're going to miss him. And it's going to take a while for whoever comes after him to be able to achieve the same kind of stuff he's able to do. He's really one of the best. So I went up to Jonathan after this sermon was over, and I said, buddy, my goodness, you had more wisdom at 28 than I had at 58. And in doing that, not only did I give him a blessing, but I also gave him permission. Because our children need permission to grow beyond us. Otherwise, they think that they must not grow further than we do. They must not be more successful than we were. And so we have to give them permission to grow beyond us. It's an Oedipal thing. And so by saying that, I gave Jonathan permission to grow beyond me in his preaching. So when the father says, bring a robe, bring sandals, bring a ring, he's saying to the son, I bless you. I believe in you. And then, kill the fatted calf to have a huge party? Now, no, we don't really know with certainty that the son is truly repentant. He's just hungry. But the story is actually not about the son. It's not about a prodigal son who sees the error of his ways and comes back and is reluctantly accepted by his father, what I was taught in my evangelical upbringing. It's not a story about the son at all. Enter the older brother. Now, the older brother has stayed home and taken care of the family farm. Ever since his brother left, he's had 1/3 less farmland to work with. He's not particularly happy about that. One of these kind of kids who always sees the glass half empty. I have a Lutheran pastor friend who says, I got a lot of those people in my church. I call them the dark Lutherans. So, he's kind of just doesn't really enjoy life much, and he's headed back from a tough day in the fields, and he sees a huge party at the house. He sends his servant into the house. Servant comes back and says, your kid brother's home. And your dad is they kind of killed the fatted calf, and they're having a big party, and your dad wants you to come in and participate in the party. And the older son refuses to go into the house. Now, make no mistake about it, squandering a family fortune on loose living, not a particularly good thing. But in that culture, to refuse to eat with your father, equally unheard of. Something that just did not happen. So what does the father do? Does he just sit there in the house and say, that kid, just leave him up there until he finally gets over it. He'll come home sometime. No. Just as he did with his younger son, he goes out looking for his older son. And when he gets there, his older son blasts him. I have worked my fingers to the bone. And I don't get so much as a goat to share with my friends, and my kid brother squanders the family fortune on loose living, and he comes home, and you kill the fatted calf for him? That's not fair. And the father says, everything I have is yours. It's always been yours. It always will be yours. But your brother was lost and has been found, and we must celebrate. And you say, that's not very fair. Excellent. It's not fair. It's not intended to be fair, and that's hard for us to take because as a species, we all have 3 moral passions, regardless of your religion, regardless of where you are in the world. We all hold the same 3 moral passions: care versus harm. If we see an individual being harmed, we want to provide care for them, particularly if it's a person who is not capable of caring for themselves. Care versus harm, that's the first. The second is liberty versus oppression. All of us hold that. Now, interestingly, we all have different perspectives on what is liberty and what is oppression, who's being oppressed, but also that is the second moral passion. The third moral passion is fairness versus unfairness. And if you don't believe that, just try to cut in line at Disney World. Just watch what happens. And so we say, this is not fair. Very good, it's not fair. We Americans want justice. We want American justice. We want people to get what they deserve. Well, this is a story about justice. It's a story about the Hebrew concept of justice, the word sadak, S-A-D-A-Q, which does not mean giving people what they deserve. It means giving people what God wants them to have. And so now we understand this is not a story about a younger son who squandered the family fortune, comes back repentant, hoping he might be better. It's not a story about an older son who stays home and keeps the rules. It's not a story about either son at all. It's a story about a father who loves, because it's what the father does, because it's who the father is, and it is the most outrageous story in the entire Bible. So when my kids were in their 20s, I wanted to take a trip with them, some kind of an epic trip with each one of them, just me and that child. And somehow it just never happened when they were in their 20s. And then when they were in their 30s, I transitioned genders. Now, when you transition genders, it's extremely difficult on your family. Occasionally, I'll talk with people who are considering transitioning, and they're always surprised when I say to them, if there's any other way, go the other way. Because when you transition genders, it's going to be extremely difficult on your family because the entire family transitions whether they want to or not. And so I always say, be careful about that because it was extremely difficult for my wife. I remember we went to a wonderful marriage therapist. He was on the south side of Denver, and he was about 110 years old. And he retired, and we happened to be his last clients on his last day. And we're both therapists, so I just asked him, I said, Mike Solomon was his name, perfect name, right? I said, Mike, how many couples are willing to try as hard as we have? He said 1%, didn't hesitate. Cool. How many couples get as far as Kathy and I have? And again, he said, well, 1%. He said, which is what makes this so tragic because you're a lesbian and she's not. That was a long drive home to Lyons from Centennial. Not a word spoken. Because we realized it was the end of our marriage. She had to be true to herself as much as I had to be true to myself. It was hard on Kathy. It was harder. On Jonathan. So when you first transition genders, you're kind of giddy, like a 13-year-old, and you tell all the people, I'm the same person I was before. Well, you're not. It's pretty obvious. And I kept saying to Jonathan, it's just a letter, meaning Paul to Paula. It's just an A, it's just a letter. And he screamed at me, it's not a blanking letter. You are fundamentally different. And he kind of disappeared for about a year and a half. I mean, gone. I didn't hear anything from him. During the latter part of that period, he started working on a book that ended up being called She's My Dad, that ended up becoming a bestseller and one of the best books out there about how a family can deal with a parent who has transitioned genders. And so toward the end, he decided he wanted me to write responses to 5 different chapters of his book, so I agreed to, and we worked that out with the publisher. And then as soon as the book came out, because it was a bestseller, we ended up being invited to do a TED Talk together. And by then, we'd worked through most of what we needed to work through. And that talk has now had, I think, 1.7 million views, something like that. And we started speaking all over the world together. And it was really very good. And the relationship we developed after that, very strong. Still not the same as before. So finally, I thought it was time to go back and say to my kids in their 40s, hey, we never took that trip. It's time to take the trip. So my youngest, 2 years from now, we're going to go somewhere in the South Pacific. My middle daughter, we're going to go to London next March to be able to watch a number of Broadway shows in the West End. But Jonathan is the oldest, and so he was going to take the first trip, and we decided to go to Scotland together. Now, we had been in Scotland 5 years ago at the TED Summit and loved it. It kind of felt like home, and I have a lot of DNA there. And so we flew into Inverness, and then we hiked a lot in the Highlands and spent most of our time on Isle of Skye. And we hiked on Isle of Skye, and we visited a lot of distilleries, and it was an epic trip. Maybe the best vacation I've ever had. So we flew back into JFK in New York, and he was getting ready to take the train back to Brooklyn. I was going to catch my flight back here. And he said, Dad, he still calls me Dad, I love it. He said, Dad, we made it through the long, dark night, all the way to dawn. I said, yeah, buddy. We did. And as I watched him walk away to the subway station, I thought, what goes around comes around. And I thought, it really is true. It's the most powerful truth on earth. Love wins. Will you pray with me? Father, we're grateful. Grateful for the scriptures that tell us these marvelous stories Jesus told. Because we aren't sure that we're really loved, no strings attached, just as we are. And we need to hear it time and again and again and again. And this is a story we all must hear. And you tell it to our souls and our hearts every day, in ways we recognize and in ways we don't. You tell us that you love us just as we are. No questions asked, no changes demanded. And because of that love, we can love others. For this is our prayer. We pray it in the name of Christ. Amen.
Each week we participate together in Eucharist. Some of you may have grown up calling it communion, others of you the Lord's Supper. And maybe it's that last descriptor, the Lord's Supper, which is most important because this is not our meal. This is the meal that Jesus celebrated with his disciples on the night he was betrayed. And as we've said before, the early church, whenever they were gathered together, would celebrate Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper, and they would call it the love feast. Because they understood that what they were representing in the bread and the wine, which is the body and the blood, was the ultimate act of love. Was the ultimate representation of God, not God saying, I'm going to give you what you deserve, but God saying, I'm going to give you what I want you to have. And that's why here at Denver Community Church, we practice an open table. We invite everyone who wishes to participate to come and to receive the bread and to receive the wine, knowing that all God asks is that you have hunger and that you have thirst. If you'd like to participate, we ask that if you want to come down to front here in the middle, you'd come down the center aisle, that if you want to go to the sides, you'd go down the side aisles and return to your seats using the diagonal aisles. When you come forward, you'll take a piece of bread and you'll hear the body of Christ broken for you. And then we ask that you would take that piece of bread and dip it into either the larger glass, which has wine, or the smaller glass that has juice, as you hear the words, the blood of Christ shed for you. And as we prepare to do that, may you hear these words from the Gospel of Matthew. While they were eating, Jesus took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." We invite you to come as you're ready.